Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Today is September 23rd, and I want to pick up where we left off before, where we were talking about the early church, and we had discussed Christianity leading up to the Council of Nicaea, where a uniform doctrine of faith was created, and probably the New Testament as well. And now what I want to do is discuss the church as it moves into the post-Roman era. Now it is admittedly a bit odd for me not to really go over Rome all that much in World Civ I, but I want to remind you it is all in the notes. Okay, so make sure that you study Rome in the material that we have posted online in the modules. Well, let's move on. As we move into the era after the fall of Western Rome, the church enters a rather significant era of transition, and to a certain extent, a bit of a crisis as challenges emerge that require the church to rethink how it operates. There are three important early theologians that are going to help move the church through this. One is Jerome, and he was an 8 there. 8. The other is Ambrose. And finally, the third is Augustine. Jerome, Ambrose, and Augustine. Jerome translated the Old and New Testaments from Greek into Latin. And as we mentioned before, Latin is the alphabet of the western part of Rome. And so moving it into Latin made it possible for many more clergy members to come on board and for the faith to spread far more effectively. Ambrose made a couple of contributions. Number one, he pushed the idea that Christians should emulate Christ. Christians should be humble. Christians should be simple. Christians should help the needy, etc. And he also argued that there should be a separation of church and state. Or in other words, Christianity is not really a Roman religion. Rome can go away and Christianity will still be there. Your faith as a Christian is not connected to the nation or the state that you happen to belong to. And as Rome is dissolving in the West, this is kind of important if people are going to continue to be Christians. Now, the real important figure that we need to talk about is the third one, Augustine. He is easily the most important early theologian. Augustine was a North African bishop, and he is going to create a work that will be the foundation of the Christian faith for a little over 1,000 years. You see, Augustine lives right about the time that Western Rome is dissolving. Once he becomes an adult, Western Rome is really starting to fall apart. And Germanic people are moving into Roman territories. There's a lot of chaos, a lot of fighting, villages being raided and burned, borders being abandoned. You get the idea. And an awful lot of people in the West are losing faith. They're beginning to walk away from the church. They're beginning to, think to themselves, well, if I'm such a good Christian, how come God seems to be so mad at me? How come God is creating such a terrible place for us when all we want to do is worship and serve? Maybe there's something fishy about all of this. And Augustine is deeply troubled here. In the year 410, a Germanic tribe actually sacked the city of Rome itself. It moved down from the north, laid siege to the city. And it was a long siege, but What was really disturbing about the whole affair was that once they got into the city, they didn't stick around for very long because they realized that there was nothing there they really wanted. They had heard about this grand city that was so wealthy and had all this stuff in it. And then when they got in, they realized these people are starving and poor, and Western Rome is actually not doing so hot. Well, anyway, that was a real wake-up call to the people in the West. That was a real sign that, yes, Rome really is going to collapse. This grand empire that we have always been taught has been around 1,000 years and will be around for thousands more. Well, maybe not so much. Now, keep in mind, and we, again, in the notes, we didn't talk about it in class. We'll talk about this here in a little bit. The eastern part of the empire doesn't collapse. The eastern part of Rome keeps going. And so Rome really didn't fall, but it did in the West. So in response to this chaos, Augustine writes a book called The City of God. And it lays out a theology that explains to the people what's going on. Now, I'm updating the terms here to make it a little more modern, but what Augustine says is that there are two worlds. There are two worlds. There is the world of man, our world, the world we're living in right now, and it is flawed, it is full of pain and suffering, it is full of all kinds of nastiness. It is an imperfect place. And anyone who has ever lived will confirm that the world is certainly not perfect. And according to Augustine, we will never make it perfect. It is impossible to make it perfect. That is outlined in the book of Genesis. When Adam and Eve are run out of the garden, God makes it very clear, you will now live in an imperfect world. It goes back to the original sin itself. Now, the world of God, which is the other world, is perfect. That is where there is no pain, no suffering, no terrible Germans that are burning down our cities. The world of God is where we want to eventually be. But right now we're in the world of man. And you see, because we live in an imperfect world, none of us get to choose when we're born or where we're born or what kind of family we're born into or what kind of environment we're raised in. Some of us get lucky. We're born in an era of peace and prosperity, or we're born to good families that take care of us. We're born in advantageous situations. Maybe we're healthy and strong and intelligent and can lead obviously very comfortable lives because of it. And of course, some of us are born in terrible times when the world is falling apart. Some of us are born, far from handsome and healthy and intelligent. Some of us are born in bad situations. Some of us are born in good situations. You get the idea. And Augustine says at the end of the day, it's the luck of the draw. That's God's will. You don't have any say in that. But as made clear in the scripture, we are all equal in the eyes of God. And if you are a good Christian and you obey the scripture, you will enter the world of God and you will experience perfection then. Now, the key to this is, as a good Christian, you are not supposed to try to perfect this world. You are not supposed to live your life trying to do everything possible to solve all of the problems that you see, and especially your problems. Because you see, if you do that, what you're really doing is worshiping yourself. If you say to yourself, I'm going to get as rich as I can, I'm going to become as powerful as I can, I'm going to achieve as much as I can, sounds to me like you're focused on you. You're being selfish. You're saying, this is all about me and how happy I can be and how successful I can be. Well, that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to focus on God instead. So God has not abandoned us because the Huns are overrunning our cities. God has not abandoned us because we live in a bad time. Newsflash, lots of people live in bad times. Lots of people are born in terrible situations. You are not special because you happen to have a bad time. Lots of other people do. Stop being so self-centered. That's what Augustine says. Be humble, worship God, you'll be fine later on. Now, why this is important to understand is that Augustine is breaking away from the worldview that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans had had. You see, if you go to an ancient Greek and you say, what should you do with life? What is your meaning here? An ancient Greek would say your meaning here is to accomplish as much as possible. You're going to be here once, and so what you need to do is go out and succeed, go out and achieve, go out and win, go out and be the best. The only way to achieve immortality is to always be remembered, right? Think King Leonidas, right? Leonidas, man, I'm going to be a victor. I'm going to win, and I'm going to be powerful, and I'm going to be the best person I can be, because when I'm gone, it's over. The Greek epics, which again, we didn't have a chance to talk about. Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, these were characters in grand epics, and the whole purpose of these was to teach stories about you becoming the best you can possibly be. Agamemnon launched the Trojan War just so he could make a name for himself. And Augustine looks at these guys and says, that's not how we're supposed to live as Christians. Those men are selfish. Those men are not models for us today. That is a form of idolatry when you choose to worship yourself and only seek glory for yourself. So be humble, be normal, be ordinary. Accept the difficulties that are put on you in this world. Accept the fact that that's part of God's plan, and you will enter the kingdom of God later. And that is a way of convincing these people that just because the world that they know is burning around them, all will be well. This is a propaganda book, basically, to get people to stay faithful. If we look at this on a little bit of a deeper level, Augustine also argues that most people are damned. Most people are not good Christians. Most people will be judged, and they're going to end up going downstairs, because most of us do not live the Christian life that we're supposed to. And he also argues that we need government and law to keep people on the straight and narrow. We need rules that keep people from destroying themselves. We are inherently flawed, and so when we're given the freedom to do what we want, we make terrible choices. And we end up becoming self-centered, and again, all we care about is ourselves, and that destroys societies. And this opens the door to kind of a debate that people have to have, and that is, do you believe that we are inherently flawed, or do you believe that we're inherently good? Are humans inherently good or evil? Kind of one of these philosophical debates that I don't want to get into too much, but Augustine would definitely say we're evil. And so I'll just ask you real quick. We got a few people here. Maybe y'all at home can think about this. Who in here says that humans are inherently evil? We're inherently flawed. Not good. If given freedom, we end up destroying ourselves. Anybody? My classes go back and forth on this over the semesters, by the way. Who in here says we're inherently good? We inherently positive? Everybody's got to vote, by the way, one or the other. I'm seeing a few people that aren't voting. What do we think? Good or evil? Evil? Okay, we're inherently evil. What are we? We're inherently evil. Okay, well, now we're getting about 50-50, right? What we really mean by this is if you are allowed to just kind of live your own life and do whatever you want without tight restrictions, will the decisions that you make be good, or will the decisions you make be bad? And if you say, I think that we're inherently good, then I say, okay, let's put that to the test. Let's get rid of all speed limit signs, right? And let's take all traffic police off the streets, and let's see how people drive, right? Anybody in here want to live that way? Nope. Because given the freedom to drive any way you want, it's going to be Mad Max out there on the road. Right? So you don't believe we're inherently good behind the wheel, right? We're inherently evil behind the wheel. But you would say, let's let people say whatever they want, right? Everybody in here agree with freedom of speech, right? Well, that means you think we're inherently good, right? Because people should be able to say what they want. You should be able to hear what you want, and it will not twist your little mind into becoming a bad person if you hear bad ideas. And so you have to kind of decide which side of that line you fall on. But Augustine would say we need rigid rules to control us and keep us moving forward, or we will destroy ourselves. And that is the role of the church, and the church should guide the government in doing so. If we look at the Western church and the Eastern church, over the course of the next several generations, they're going to start to split in some notable ways. Now, we mentioned the Eastern Church before. The Western Church was headed by the Bishop of Rome. The Eastern Church didn't subscribe to that, and so they decided to have their own Patriarch of Constantinople. And so we have one Christian church, but we have two versions of it in the East and the West. And you'll recall the Western Church will today be considered the Roman Catholic Church, but the Eastern Church is considered the Orthodox Church. Y'all remember that from last time, correct? Okay, good. Well, there are going to be some differences that emerge that are worth discussing. In the Eastern Church, Greek will remain the key language, hence Greek Orthodox Church, because of the language. But in the Western Church, Latin will become dominant. Jerome's move to push Latin onto the Western Church ended up sticking. And to this day, actually, Latin is the official language of the Catholic Church. Now, we're not talking about Protestant churches. The Reformation comes later, but we'll get to that at the end of the class. Of course, in the Western Church, it is centered in Rome. The Eastern Church is centered in Constantinople. That's Istanbul today. In the Western Church, clergy are required to be celibate. All clergy are required to be celibate. This means you cannot marry, you cannot have a family. Celibacy isn't specifically no sex. Celibacy is more no marriage, because you're not supposed to sleep with anybody outside of marriage anyway. So the idea of celibacy is really related to marriage. Nobody's allowed to sleep around outside of marriage in the eyes of the church, of course. In the Eastern Church, celibacy was only required of the upper clergy. Ordinary common priests were allowed to marry. Now, celibacy as a requirement for priests sure seems like a weird rule. Why on earth would you tell a man you're not allowed to marry, you're not allowed to have a family at all if you're a member of the clergy? And this isn't a rule that was ironclad from the beginning. It wasn't actually firmly established until about the 11th century, but it grew over the generations. Why is that rule in place? Why would the church do that? It seems rather odd to expect that of someone. What would the purpose be? Anyone? Actually, there's two. Okay, there's an official reason and then there's an unofficial reason. The official reason is the church argues that you cannot be married to God and have all of the obligations of a clergyman and have also the obligations of a husband and a father. You can't split your time. You must be completely dedicated to the church or you don't get to be a clergyman. And the only way to do that is to vow to never have a wife or family. But on a more practical level, what it means is that high-ranking clergy cannot pass their titles on to their sons. We don't want to have entrenched inherited power in the church. And that's what happens whenever somebody gets into a position of power. They want to make sure their son turns out all right. And so we don't want the Pope to inherit the title from his father or a bishop to inherit the office from his father. And so by not permitting any legitimate children, the church makes sure that doesn't happen. Now, in the East, they wanted to do that too. And as I said, the upper clergy are also celibate, but they couldn't get enough priests. And so they said, okay, if you just want to stay a low-level priest, you can have a family. But if you want to move up, then you have to be. And it was a simple matter of recruiting. Over the centuries, the Eastern and the Western churches have kind of gone back and forth in their friendship. For a while, they were completely separate and almost enemies, to be honest with you. They didn't like each other. And then there's been centuries when they were getting along pretty well. Most recently, the Eastern and Western churches have actually kind of gotten back together. They're still not 100% on the same team, but at least they recognize each other. Here is actually a modern picture. And you can see the Pope there. That's Pope Francis, and Dumbledore next to him. That's the Patriarch. That's the current Patriarch of Constantinople. He is the Eastern Pope, if you will. And they were willing to meet and be friends and pray together and kind of recognize each other as bishops, sort of. They come up with these complicated statements on the matter. You also see, I have right there a picture of an Eastern clergyman. One of the traditions, and this is just purely tradition, Western clergy tend to be clean-shaven, no beard, no mustache. Often they shave their heads. But in the East, it's exactly the opposite. I mean, they just kind of grow everything out, and having a big, long beard and all is part of the Eastern tradition. And why those would work out that way, you tell me. And it's worth noting that the Eastern Church isn't just in the East. Okay, over the centuries, of course, people, members of the Orthodox Church have gone to other parts of the world. There is actually, and I've got a picture here, there's an Eastern Orthodox Church just right up the street from here. Yeah, it's just a few roads over. There's also another one over in Mobile. So the Orthodox Church is outside of the East, but nevertheless, it is concentrated in the East. And where it exists today is basically Turkey, into the Middle East, and into Russia, which we'll get to in a minute. It is worth noting that there are a lot of Eastern Christians that do live in areas that we don't associate with Christianity today. Lebanon, which we think of as an Islamic country, is actually 50% Christian. They're Eastern Christians for the most part. I believe Egypt has somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million Christians. And these are ethnic Egyptian people who are Christians and are not recent converts. These are people who have a Christian tradition dating all the way back. A man by the name of Saint Cyril is given credit for converting the Slavic people to Christianity. And this is Eastern Christianity. And he did this during the Middle Ages, which we're going to talk about. And this is most noteworthy because the Russians would become Christian, and they are Eastern Christian. And so the Russian Orthodox Church is an Orthodox version. They are Eastern Christians. Also others in Southeastern Europe. The Orthodox Church tends to be big there. What is the one Slavic nation that is not Eastern Christian? What is the one Slavic nation that's Catholic? Anybody know? I'm sorry? I thought you almost said it. Poland. Poland is a Catholic nation, even though the Poles are not Western Europeans. They're more Slavic people. And that is significant because a couple of popes ago, Pope John Paul II was Polish. And he was the first non-Italian pope in a long time. And it was notable not just that he wasn't from Italy, but that he was from a Slavic nation. And he was from a communist nation, which played a role in why he was chosen. But I'm getting into the weeds. We also will see, moving forward, in the post-Roman era, the Eastern Roman Empire continues to move forward. The Eastern Roman Empire is going to exist for roughly another 1,000 years after the fall of Western Rome. But we won't call it the Roman Empire anymore. We will call it the Byzantine Empire. We will call it the Byzantine Empire. With a capital of Constantinople, it is a huge empire that will stretch from Greece all the way around into Egypt at one time or another. And really, when Western Rome collapsed, probably the eastern part of the empire didn't think much of it. It was mostly gone by that point anyway, so it really wasn't that big of a deal, or it very likely wasn't. One very important Eastern emperor is Justinian. And he becomes emperor in the year 527. He is determined to reconquer Western Rome, bring it back. So he waged a number of wars to try to do so and actually achieved quite a bit. It's just it really wasn't worth it. The wars were more bloody and destructive than they should have been, and most of it ended up getting lost anyway. So it wasn't as if it was all that significant. And Justinian himself really had an amazing kind of crazy rule. He came from the lower ranks of society. His wife Theodora did as well. They clawed their way all the way to the top, and all kinds of crazy stuff happened while he was emperor. There was a big plague, for example, lots of stuff. But Justinian was a devout Christian, and he will establish this tradition of the Byzantine Empire being the defender of Christianity. The Byzantine Empire isn't just a Christian empire, it is a super Christian empire. And it makes very clear that it will defend the faith completely and represent the faith as much as possible. And Christianity and the Byzantine Empire get very closely tied together. Justinian will order, and this is a good example. Oh, real quick. Here is a map of Justinian's conquests. This is what the Eastern Empire would have looked like after he died in pink. And so you can see he reconquers Italy and big chunks of Eastern Europe. And then he moves into the west, big chunks of North Africa, etc. And so it really does look like he's putting the west back together again, but most of it ends up going back after he dies, and so it was really more chaotic than anything else. Justinian orders the construction of what was at the time the grandest structure in the Western world. The greatest church ever built, at least again up to that point. And it is the Church of Saint Sophia, Hagia Sophia, which sits dead in the center of Constantinople. And again, that is Istanbul today. And it is a preserved building. You can go there today. This is not just designed to demonstrate the power of Christianity and the empire's endorsement of Christianity, but also the power of the empire itself, because it is such an awe-inspiring building. You know, it is as great as anything the Romans ever built during the Pax Romana. What really makes this so remarkable is the dome on top. It is a square building, as you can see, and then that big dome on top is not easy to do. That requires a tremendous amount of engineering skill. There's some real math that goes into that. And it is sort of modeled after the Roman Pantheon, which had done that centuries earlier. Now, the building's gone through some changes over the centuries. You know, when the Turks conquered Constantinople and turned it into their own capital, and it became the Islamic Empire, the Ottoman Empire, they turned it into a mosque. That's what those 4 minarets are there for. They, turned it into a mosque instead of a church. So that's what that's all about. But you can go there today, and you certainly should put it on your bucket list. That big dome is really something else. I've never been there, but it's certainly on mine. In the 1980s, it was turned into a museum. The Turkish government officially declared it a museum. And that way it could start to be restored. And what they did is they started taking off plaster that had been put up by the Turks, and the early Christian iconography, the mosaics, these beautiful mosaics that dated back to the time of Justinian, could then be seen again. And they're really remarkable. And this is really worth checking out. This very early Christian artwork that nobody had seen for hundreds of years is now suddenly available. And that, of course, opens the door to a big debate. What should be restored and what shouldn't, because there's also Islamic art on the walls now. And you would have to destroy that in order to reveal the Christian. So you can see the debate that goes along there. But anyway, it's well worth seeing. It's a neat place. I certainly plan to go there someday. And with that, I want to move back to Western Europe, because we will enter a new period. We will enter a new period. The early Middle Ages, or better known as the Dark Ages. That's the traditional term for them. The early Middle Ages, or what's often referred to as the Dark Ages. So draw a big line in your notes, because I do want to discuss this. New topic. When Western Rome started to dissolve, Germanic tribes that had been kept out of Rome began to migrate en masse to the west and resettle lands in Roman territory and merge with the Roman people. And it is from this merger that we get the foundation of European culture. And there's a few different tribes that I just want to mention real quick. Few tribes I just want to point out. One group are, let me erase this here. One group are the Visigoths. And the Visigoths settle in present-day Spain. Another group are the Ostrogoths. And they settle in North Italy. The Vandals. They settle in North Africa. And they move around to a lot of places. Another group known as the Franks. They settle, of course, in France. It's where the name comes from. The Angles and the Saxons settle in England. That's where the term Anglo-Saxon comes from. These are all Germanic tribes, big tribal groups that come in and see this Roman territory and say, free land, we're taking it. And once they get there, they, of course, merge with the Roman culture, as I mentioned earlier. And elements of Rome remain, but then Germanic culture gets blended with them. No phones, please. So let's talk about the Dark Ages. What does this represent? And historians certainly debate this. I'm not saying that this is absolute fact here, but this is the going belief. The Dark Ages were a period of decline and chaos. And certainly when compared to Rome, it's pretty obvious that they were. So what do I really mean by this? Well, for one thing, there is a decline of trade and industry, less business, less economic activity. Less general prosperity. A decline in skills as craftsmen and skilled laborers die off and are not replaced. Things become more primitive in that regard. There's also a decline in infrastructure. Aqueducts quit working and are not repaired. Bridges crack and collapse and are not rebuilt. Roads fall into disrepair and become unsafe as bandits and bad guys stake them out. The skill necessary to keep the infrastructure up gets lost, and there's no money or resources to do it anyway. There is, of course, a lack of central government, which means that there's a lack of law and order. Literacy declines. High learning definitely goes down. Roads and libraries and such start to close. Within about 100 or so years after the fall of Western Rome, the only literate people left are basically the clergy. And even then, that's kind of a stretch. It would really be the high clergy that were literate. Even, lower ranking clergy, a lot of them were illiterate too. And all these Germanic people that come in, they don't bother to learn anything. They're not going to become literate. Even their leaders, don't bother with it. That's not what they do. We see, in the absence of strong central government, the emergence of different regions ruled by chiefs and warlords. And they, of course, all fight each other, so there's a lot of violence and nastiness. And out of this environment, we're going to have a new culture get built. Now, one of the debates that is certainly worth having is, despite all that's happening on the surface, was life for the average peasant really all that different in the Dark Ages as perhaps it had been at the height of Rome? And honestly, probably not all that much. If you're a poor peasant farmer, you're a poor peasant farmer. It really doesn't matter who's in charge, does it? And so, yes, times were definitely not good, and you would have recognized that there might have been a better era in the past, but honestly, you probably wouldn't have known much. The vast majority of the people would not know the difference between the height of Rome and the depth of the Dark Ages. But certainly on a larger level, it can be seen. The Germanic people are seen by the Romans as cultureless barbarians. uncivilized, obnoxious, way too much body hair, and way too infrequent bathing is kind of how they're seen. One Roman general as Rome was starting to fall, talked about how his dogs were more civilized than the German soldiers he had to deal with. And when he recruited Germans into his army, he actually fed the dogs before he fed them because he argued that the dogs were more deserving. There's a writing about that. Now, the Germans did have law, and they did have culture, and they did have customs. They were just very different from that of the Romans. And so I believe one of our discussion questions is what really makes culture, right? Because on the one hand, you can definitely tell the difference between a dirty, smelly German and a, clean, cultured Roman. But at the same time, does that really mean that the Roman culture is superior to that of the Germans? That's one of our essay topics. One of our discussion questions. And so that's why I'm pointing that out. But nonetheless, these two cultures merge together, and from it we get Europeans. One of the Germanic leaders that becomes particularly important is Clovis. And he is a Frankish chief in the late 5th century. And he wants to be more powerful. He wants to be a big man. And Clovis is leading his people into this Roman area. And he sees that most of the people are Christian, and he is a strategic thinker. And Clovis comes to realize that the Pope is somebody that he ought to be friends with. If he is now trying to rule over a big region where there's a lot of Christians, the Pope is kind of a guy who I need in my pocket. And so Clovis went to the Pope and proposed a deal. And now again, Clovis is one of these dirty, hairy, smelly Germans, and the Pope certainly wouldn't have thought very much of him for that. But what do you think Clovis can offer the Pope? Now that his Frankish people have migrated into what is today France, and he goes to the Pope, what can he offer him? What does he have that the Pope might want? The Pope's going to listen to this guy for a reason. What can Clovis offer him? And there's two things that Clovis can offer him. What do you think it might be? Number one, it would be protection. This guy has an army. And so if you're the Pope and, you say, hey, this guy can look out for me. If I need a friend, this guy might not be a bad one to have. So he can offer the Pope protection. He can also offer the Pope, the second benefit is that he can offer the Pope an awful lot more Christians. Because all of these Germans migrating in are themselves not Christian. They're Germanic. They have their own sort of pagan religions. And Clovis can go to the Pope and say, there's an awful lot of these guys, and I will turn them all into Christians for you. Which means all of them will now pay a tithe. All of them will now recognize you. And the church is not interested in having competing religions where it is. And so the Clovis offers the Pope an alliance. I will make all of the Franks Christian, and I will promise to look after you. But the Pope has to give Clovis something in return. Now, what can the Pope offer Clovis? What does Clovis get out of this deal? Power, bingo. I want us to think back to the early Mesopotamian gods, right? It works a lot better when the gods are the ones who are behind the king. And Clovis says, I want God to make me king. Because if the Pope can bless Clovis, then Clovis has a degree of authority that no other Germanic king can claim. And so God is now going to make Clovis the king. Clovis is there because of God's will. And Clovis is going to turn around and work with the Pope. You can see they're scratching each other's backs, aren't they? The Pope gives Clovis what he can give him, and Clovis gives the Pope. Clovis, of course, becomes a Christian himself. The big Germanic conversion to Christianity is represented by Clovis, who himself becomes baptized. And of course, if you're going to do it, you might as well do it naked in a barrel, right? Make it count. And after that, of course, Clovis demanded all of the Franks become Christian. He executed quite a few that refused. And the other Germanic tribes are going to follow suit. They too will go to the Pope and they will become Christianized as well. And they will also pledge allegiance to the Pope in return. They realize the power of the Christian church. They realize the authority that the Pope has. And it is very much to their benefit to have the Pope on their side. And Clovis is really the Germanic king that spearheads this. Now, very quickly, this gets a little complicated. So I'm sorry in advance, but this is going to lead us somewhere. So hang in there with me. People don't really have last names at this time, but we're going to put this in a modern way. Clovis was a member of the Merovingian family. That's the closest thing to a last name that we'll put on him. And so he creates a dynasty, and when the king dies, the king's son becomes king, so on and so forth. You all know that. And so the Merovingian family becomes the ruling family of the Franks. And for several generations, the Merovingians are the kings of the Franks. Kings tend to have a prime minister, a right-hand man, somebody who will execute his laws and carry out his orders. And the role of the prime minister could vary from one place to the next. We will see this throughout the world, throughout history. Anytime you've got a king, he's always got kind of a right-hand man who does this. And over time, within the kingdom of the Franks, we will see another family, the Carolingian family, assume that role. And it becomes hereditary as well. And the Carolingian right-hand man was called the steward. Now, he is obviously a servant of the king as well, but as you can probably imagine, this guy is going to be very powerful in his own right. As the king's assistant and the man who carries out the king's order, the man who has the ear of the king more than anyone else. I can meet with him anytime he wants. He follows my suggestions. We are a team. This guy is very powerful. As a matter of fact, as you could probably imagine, sooner or later, the steward ends up more powerful than the king himself. The king kind of becomes more of a figurehead, and the guy running the show is this guy. And so a new family is in charge, even though the king is in another family. So the Carolingians, and over a few centuries, and the borders change and things like that. I'm not getting into the details. But we end up with a steward, a Carolingian prime minister named Charles Martel. A Carolingian prime minister named Charles Martel. And by the time he assumes his office, he is definitely more powerful than the king. The king is just a schmuck living in a palace, or whatever they would consider a palace at the time. And if you're wondering why I'm skipping over so much, it's because we don't really have a lot of records, to be honest with you. Historians really just don't know a lot of what happened during the early Middle Ages because nothing was really written down. There's very sparse records from this era. But we do know that Charles Martel was easily the most powerful man in the kingdom of the Franks, despite the fact that he doesn't have the title. Well, y'all can see where this is going to go, right? Not so fast. Charles Martel is going to save the kingdom of the Franks when Muslims invaded it in 732. And that big pink area is what the kingdom of the Franks look like by the time he is in charge. And the battle was the Battle of Tours. And it was 732. A big Islamic army invaded from what is today Spain, and a Frankish army fought them on the battlefield and won and saved the kingdom of the Franks from Islamic conquest. And the man who did it was Charles Martel, not the king. And Charles Martel clearly is a popular man among the army. And Charles Martel is a popular man. The Pope likes him too. Because, of course, if the Muslims had been able to conquer the kingdom of the Franks, you can see Italy is right there. And so the Pope is obviously a big fan of Charles Martel as well. But let's not assume anything. No, Charles Martel did not do what you think he was going to do. When he died, he was still a servant of the king. However, Charles Martel did have a son who inherited that title as steward, and his son was named Pepin. Pepin the Short, to be more specific. Like I said, we don't really have last names, and so he is Pepin the Short. Pepin is not interested in playing by the rules. Pepin wants to be king. Pepin's looking around. He sees the king has no real authority or power or even competence. Why am I serving him? I ought to be king myself. Now, of course, the Germanic codes and rules are very clear here. They have not gone away despite the fact that several generations have passed. If Pepin just kicks the king off the throne and says, I'm king now, that might not work. There's an awful lot of people who still believe we should be loyal to the king, of course. The army likes Pepin, but maybe I shouldn't just make it so simple. Who can make Pepin king? Who can say, yeah, you're king, because God decided it? The Pope, exactly. So Pepin turned to the Pope and asked the Pope to make him king. Because if it's God's will, then there we go. And there's a moral to all of it, because the Pope didn't just say, okay, fine, you're king. What do you think the Pope did? Just like with Clovis a few centuries earlier. Yeah, what's in it for me? That's right, let's bargain. You want to be king? I can make it happen. You're going to have to do something for me too, and maybe we can make a deal. It's all about making a deal, isn't it? And on that note, we'll figure out what Pepin did to become king next time. Okay, everyone, real quick, I want to remind everybody, in a week and a half, we will have our test. Okay, now I'm going to mention this again, but just follow me and follow me at home. I'm giving this test in class. Okay, I'm going to give the test on Monday and Wednesday. You can pick the day you want to take it. Okay, so either day you show up, you can take it. It's up to you. Okay, if you are quarantined because of COVID, and I guess I'm talking to people at home because of this, or obviously if that happens to you, but let's hope it doesn't. If there is a COVID-related quarantine, I'm going to need to get in touch with you, and we'll arrange for you to take it in a proctored environment, not in the classroom, okay? But otherwise, week after next, exam 1 is going to be there. I'm going to put up a study guide. It will cover modules 1, 2, and 3, and we'll go over some more details on that moving forward. But I want that to be in the back of everyone's mind. All right, sound good? All right, everyone, y'all take care. I'll see you next week.